The presidential candidate who was running explicitly on climate change, Governor Jay Inslee, has pulled out of the race. So what is the state of climate change in the 2020 battle? Also, deficit is set to exceed $12 trillion. And also, we got to talk about Mayor Pete's supporters.
The Team Rising is here to dig in. Will Jawando is a Democratic strategist and council member at large in Montgomery County, Maryland. Inez Stepman is a senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum.
She's all the things, let's be honest. Looking fabulous as well, as always, as are you two, Will.
Yeah, welcome, guys.
Let's talk a little bit about climate change. There's a lot going on. First and foremost, the Amazon rainforest burning at an unprecedented rate, so that's certainly the backdrop for all of this conversation. But, Will, you have Jay Inslee dropping out of the race, was never really able to get a lot of traction around a campaign that was focused on climate crisis as the most existential threat. What do you make of that development?
Well, I think he did a good job in elevating the issue. You see all his former competitors now coming out and praising him. We may be looking at, if we get a Democratic president, the next Secretary of the Interior.
That's interesting.
He elevated the issue. He did it credit on the debate stages that he did make. And he was a real grassroots supporter, and he pushed, I think, the other folks to come out with ambitious plans. I know we may talk about Bernie Sanders' plan later, but I think that is in part attributable to not only the crisis, obviously the size of London burning off of the Amazon, which is insane, but the fact that he elevated that issue and pushed his colleagues to talk about it. So I think he had a successful, obviously not successful in the terms that he's not able to stick around, but for what he was trying to do, I think he's going to be a well sought after endorsement as well.
Yeah, I think that's fair. What do you think, Inez? I mean, because it's not just that piece, but then also it's just so interesting. Here you have a successful, governor who is in the right place on the issues, who, looks presidential, whatever that means. Like, you can imagine in a previous time, in a previous election year, this guy having been the guy, and yet really couldn't get off the ground.
Yeah, I mean, it's somewhat surprising. It's not surprising that he wasn't in the top tier, but it is a little surprising he could never push beyond 1%, right? And that didn't even qualify him for the town hall coming up on his signature issue. Although I would say this is kind of the textbook way, or at least in my opinion, to run a outside chance campaign. He had a single issue. He did succeed in elevating it.
Yeah,
he elevated his own profile. He's going to run for an unprecedented third term back home. And, it's hard to say that he didn't get anything out of this, which I think, you could say about some of the other folks who dropped out. I think he did what he came to do, which is more than you can say for some folks.
Yeah, absolutely. So who do y'all think will be the next person that will drop out?
She's brutal. Yeah. She wants to know whose heads are going to roll next.
I'll let you answer that question.
You know what? Who knows? But we definitely need to narrow down this field some, and I think the debates are doing that, having those thresholds. I mean, that's kind of why Inslee dropped out. He didn't qualify. He wasn't likely to qualify in terms of the polls for the next debate. Like I said, he didn't qualify even for the town hall on climate change. And so I think it is time for some of these thresholds to start narrowing candidates down, although of course you don't want to silence voices that might, like his elevate a particular issue that is important to the electorate. So there is value in having them there, but I feel like it's kind of coming to an end.
It is crazy to me that Andrew Yang qualified for the debate and Inslee didn't.
The Yang gang has a lot of support.
They've got real power, man. It's coming up.
Look, if you look at the polls, I think CNN had one out yesterday. There is a consistent, you have Warren and Sanders staying consistently around 14-15%. Biden went up a little bit, 29%. And then you have this kind of second tier, Kamala Harris, Buttigieg, Booker, between that 3 to 2 and 3 to 4%.
I mean, I'll tell you, actually, Andrew Yang is coming in that fifth, sixth range in a lot of these polls at this point.
That's right.
Yeah. So. Well, and I think your point that both of you alluded to on the climate change piece is important, which is that so many of the candidates have been forced to put out ambitious climate change proposals and take it seriously. Bernie Sanders today out with the most ambitious of all the plans and includes, creation of 20 million new jobs. I mean, it's a real serious and sizable approach to dealing with this issue. I think it's meant in a way that we didn't need the candidate that was just focused on climate change because the other major candidates were focused on it as well.
Look, and climate change is one of those issues where there's a huge split between the Democratic primary electorate and the general public, right? So in polls about in Democratic voters and likely primary voters, we see it as issue number 1, issue number 2 behind health care. We have seen consistent interest in it as an issue. Among the general electorate and likely voters, it's number 17.
Right. No,
right?
90-something% of Democratic primary voters say it's an important issue to be dealt with, or a very important issue to be dealt with. But yeah, the general electorate, it's a different story.
The general electorate is not thinking about climate change. They don't think of it as a top-tier issue. So it remains to be seen. But whether, proposing all of these really ambitious plans, very, very expensive plans, very radical plans, these are things that, voters in the general election are not necessarily interested in or even turned off by. So there is that constant push-pull between all primaries, right? How do you excite the primary electorate and win your primary versus saying things that you're going to have to walk back or that are going to hurt you?
Interestingly, the Green New Deal polls really well right now.
It does.
It's the first time Democrats have really put a just transition for working class people who work in the fossil fuel industry at the center of what they need to do. And to me, that's a sort of sea change in thinking.
No, I'd agree, and I think taking the New Deal and adding green to it, New Deal was pretty successful and has a good reputation. Senator Sanders' plan is very robust, and I think you will see, as the dots are connected for more Americans, as they see these floods, the heat waves that we've seen this summer, people are starting to connect the dots in a way that I think communities haven't traditionally done, and I think you will see that number continue to rise, even in the general electorate. It's already important, to your point, in the Democratic primary electorate, particularly with liberals. I think you're going to see climate change continue to rise as an issue, even in the general election.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious about that point, because you do see, especially among millennial Republicans, the issue of climate change ticking up. They're more aware of it, and they're starting to talk a little bit more about carbon tax, carbon capture, technology, those types of things. But I'm curious to hear your perspective, though, on if a Democrat, with the way that they approach climate change, actually would appeal to more moderate, I'll say, climate change viewers, people who are just coming around on the topic, because it may be too far to the left, some of the proposals that they're doing, even if they're coming around on the topic.
And first of all, I would say the polling on the Green New Deal, a lot of people don't know the substance of it. In fact, a lot of, we don't really know the substance of it yet. Sanders has this plan, and then when you start talking about some of these things, just modernizing, just updating the grid, a small part of Sanders' plan costs as much as we spend, and we deficit spend, as we'll get to, in an entire year. Right? This is not something that can be paid for by taxes on oil companies or sort of soaking the rich. This is going to require a massive tax raise on the middle class. So, and I think that once we start to get to the actual policies, rather than something like the Green New Deal that sounds good, people like FDR's New Deal, and connect that, they like environmental policies in the abstract. But when we start talking about how much this is going to cost, what the impact is going to be on the middle class, I think that you're going to get a lot of pushback from moderates.
But here's the other piece, Will. What's the alternative? I mean, if the scientists are right, we have to have that World War II level of mobilization to deal with this threat and lead the world in a better place. And so, that's why you see people who are focused on this issue saying, you really can't compromise on it. You've got to be all in for it. You have to be committed to a pretty big and pretty radical plan, or else we're not going to hit the markers that we have to hit.
And what that means is, to take your point to its logical conclusion, we won't have a planet. And I think we are in an emergency. It's not a could have done or we should have done this.
Or let's work with Mitch McConnell for something that he can agree with.
And I think you're even seeing people saying, like, carbon tax and some of the things that were proposed 10, 15, 20 years ago, they're not going to do it.
Not enough anymore.
And so we're going to need to have some of these radical proposals. So I do think we need to shock the system if we want my kids, our grandkids, to have something to have an earth to be on.
All right, we got more we're going to get to with these two. Stick with us. We'll be right back.